Have you ever found yourself in one of those moments where your heart's pounding, your mouth goes dry, and everything inside you screams, "Say something," but fear wraps its hands around your voice and tells you to stay silent? Yeah, we've all been there. The story of Esther isn't just some ancient tale tucked away in the pages of history. It's a mirror reflecting those exact moments in our lives when we're backed into a corner facing a choice that could change everything. Esther was just an ordinary young woman thrown into the heart of a powerful empire, standing at a crossroads. Stay silent and maybe save herself, or speak up and possibly save an entire nation. In this video, you'll see that courage doesn't mean being fearless. It means stepping up even when your knees are shaking. You'll see how faith, real, lived-out faith, can shift the course of history and yours too. But here's the thing. This isn't a message to bookmark for later. This is for right now because maybe, just maybe, you're standing in your own Esther moment and the clock is ticking. So don't just watch this with your eyes, watch it with your soul. Because when silence starts weighing heavier than your words, that's when you know it's time to rise up and speak. Esther, in the days of Ahasuerus. Have you ever heard of Ahasuerus? Maybe the name doesn't sound that familiar, but what about Xerxes? Yes, that powerful Persian king still known today for his conquests. He's the same man. He ruled Persia between 486 and 465 before Christ. And it was precisely during his reign that Esther's story unfolded. To better understand this scenario, let's take a quick trip back in time. In 586 before Christ, the Jews were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. Imagine the pain of a people torn from their land, living under the weight of exile. But not all was lost. In 538 before Christ, Cyrus, a Persian king with a surprisingly generous heart, authorized the return of the Jews to their homeland. A breath of hope was rekindled. Then, in 479 before Christ, Esther appears, a young Jewish woman courageous and full of grace who against all odds becomes Queen of Persia. A woman in the right place at the right time, chosen by God for a purpose greater than she could ever imagine. Later in 458 before Christ, Ezra received permission from the court to lead a new journey, bringing more Jews back to Jerusalem. This was 21 years after the remarkable events described in the book of Esther. Do you see the connection? It's as if God was orchestrating everything behind the scenes with a precision that only He possesses. Now, here's a detail that can't be ignored. The book mentions men who understood the times, and that makes us think. Sometimes those who live far from the faith seem to understand the present moment better than many who are considered wise among believers. A touch of irony there, don't you think? But it's also a warning. Knowing how to discern the times to see beyond the surface is far too precious to ignore. By the way, if you want to dive deeper into this topic, take a look at 1 Chronicles 12:32. Esther in place of Vashti. She was just an ordinary girl, no title, no status, no spotlight. But it was exactly this girl, Esther, whom God placed on the throne in Vashti's place. Now, here's something curious. The book of Esther never directly mentions the name of God, not even once. Still, His presence is felt in every twist of the story, like an invisible wind that shifts the sails even when the sea appears calm. Everything happens at the right time in the right place, and with the right people when Vashti refuses to go to the king's banquet. Chapter 1-2. It seems like a mere act of pride, but that's where the gears of the divine plan begin to turn. That's what opens the way for a young Jewish girl with no great ambitions to be crowned Queen of Persia. 1518. Then comes Mori, Esther's cousin and guardian. He uncovers a deadly conspiracy against the king and saves his life. Coincidence? Of course not. God was orchestrating everything silently. And when it seemed like nothing more could happen, the king shows favor to Esther, honors Mori at the exact moment Haman, the Jews' enemy, was plotting evil, and even helped save an entire people who were on the brink of extermination. Chapters 7 and 8. All this culminates with Mori being exalted, gaining voice and respect within the empire. It's as if God, the great author of history, had written each chapter with tears, courage, and promise. And there's more. Back in chapter 2.6, it says Morai was taken into exile. But in reality, it was his great-grandfather Kish. He had been taken along with King Janiah in 597 before Christ. That marked the beginning of a long journey of pain and displacement. But look at this. Even in a foreign land, God did not forget his people. He was preparing decades in advance the characters who would be used at the right time. And when Esther is finally crowned queen, she could very well have set aside her humility, distanced herself from her roots, and forgotten who she was. But she didn't. She continued listening to Morai, respecting his guidance. She wasn't seduced by the crown's glitter. That says a lot about who she was on the inside. Humble, sensitive, wise. Even inside the palace with all its pomp and power, she kept her faith and identity alive. That's when we understand God doesn't need thunder or lightning to act. Sometimes he chooses silence, but that silence moves heaven and earth. Esther shows us that even without mentioning God's name, the entire story pulses with his presence. And the message is clear. It doesn't matter where you are or what you're facing. God is already there preparing everything, even the details that seem far too small. So if today you feel small, out of place, or even forgotten, remember this. Maybe just like Esther, you are being positioned on purpose for such a time as this. And the author of your story never misses a chapter. Mordecai did not bow. Morai wouldn't bow, and it wasn't out of pride. It was something much deeper, loyalty to God. Everyone around him bent the knee before Haman. After all, he was the strong man of the empire, the king's favorite. But Morai stood tall, firm, unshakable. Why? Because that kind of reverence wasn't just a political gesture. It touched something sacred. It was an honor that in his conscience belonged to God alone. He couldn't kneel before a man, no matter how powerful, without betraying what he believed. You know, he wasn't the first. Way back, Daniel's 3 friends also chose the fiery furnace instead of bowing before Nebuchadnezzar's statue. It's as if every generation faces its own giants, its own defining moment to say, this far and no further. And then someone asks, but why would he do that? The answer was simple, direct, no sugarcoating. He was a Jew back then. That meant a lot. Being a Jew was carrying in your soul the memory of exile, of discipline, of purification. The people had learned through blood and pain that idolatry is non-negotiable. That faith isn't something you dilute just to fit in. And that raises a question that echoes in our hearts. What does it mean to be a Christian today? Are we like Maury willing to stand when the whole world is pressuring us to bow? Or are we trading convictions for convenience? Ochmon wasn't just annoyed by Morai's boldness. He wanted to wipe out all the Jews from the empire. Yes, he planned a genocide. And here's what's chilling. He was the first politician in the Bible to plot the extermination of the Jews, but he wouldn't be the last. Antiochus Epiphanes tried the same in the 2nd century BC, Hitler in the 20th century. And the Bible says that in the end times, the Antichrist will also rise with fury against Jews and Christians. It's a dark pattern that repeats itself throughout history. Light disturbs darkness. What is holy always provokes what is profane. And look at what Haman did. He cast pur, a kind of lot or dice, to pick the best day to begin the destruction. Almost a year passed between the casting of the lot and the plan being set in motion. A whole year. But God was using every single day of that waiting period to turn the tide in silence in the way only He knows how. It was enough time for Morai and Esther to rise up and face evil with faith and courage. Haman hated the Jews because they were different. Their laws, their way of life, their reverence for one true God. It all bothered him. He saw them as a people set apart, and he hated that separation. But look, that's exactly what God wanted. He called Israel to be different, to live in a way no other people did. And today, under the new covenant, He calls you and me the same way. to be set apart, holy, bought at a high price. As 1 Peter 2:9 says, the truth, the world still hates what it doesn't understand. And those who walk with God will inevitably swim against the current. But in the end, as Esther and Morai proved, it's worth it because God does not abandon those who stand for him. And what if you stay, if you are completely silent? That was basically the question Morai asked Esther. But it wasn't just a question. It was a cry from the soul. He believed with all his heart that God had placed Esther in that palace with that crown, not by chance, but for a purpose, to be the hand of deliverance for the people of Israel. But even though he believed in God's plan, Maury wasn't naive. He knew that God's purpose wasn't a straight line where everything automatically works out. He knew Esther had a choice, and that if she chose to remain silent out of fear, out of comfort, trying to save her own skin, she herself would end up destroyed along with her people. It's harsh, isn't it? But it's real. God is sovereign. Yes, he writes the great chapters of history, but he waits for us to say yes when it's our turn to act. It's as if heaven and earth pause for a moment, waiting for our response. That's when Maury released that phrase that still echoes in the hearts of those living between fear and faith. Who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That question burns like fire because maybe you too are living ordinary days while an extraordinary calling stands right in front of your eyes. Maybe God has placed you exactly where you are, not to live a comfortable life, but to rise when no one else dares. And what did Esther do? She took a deep breath and said, "If I perish, I perish." Just like that. She understood that obedience would be costly, but staying silent would cost even more. So she chose to risk everything, her position, her comfort, even her life to fulfill what was burning in God's heart. You know, a lot of people today are trying to hold on to their roles, their reputations, their social media, their titles, and to keep all that, they prefer silence. But God doesn't move through those who stay silent out of fear. He honors those who speak, who stand, who take a position for love of him and the truth, even if it means paying a high price. And Maury and Esther, they weren't seeking glory. They were willing to die, if necessary, to confront evil with courage and faith. They became symbols of people who obey their conscience, even when it goes against everything and everyone. And maybe, just maybe, God is calling you the same way. For such a time as this, all this does not satisfy me. Haman had everything. Money, plenty of it. Status, one of the highest in the empire. Recognition, influence, parties, flatterers, all within his reach. But every time he saw Maurai standing firm and unshakable, all of it seemed meaningless. "All of this gives me no satisfaction," he said. And in that one sentence, the poison of an empty soul leaks out. Because that's exactly what Haman was, a man full on the outside, but dry on the inside. He had conquered the world, yet couldn't sleep in peace because one single man refused to bow before him. You see, what bothered Haman wasn't Morai's defiance. It was what Mordai represented. Integrity, faith, courage, a strength that can't be bought with coins or earned with titles. Deep down, Haman knew. He knew that Mordai, without a crown, without position, without political power, was greater than he was. And that hurt because before God, true greatness has never been measured by applause, wealth, or titles. God isn't impressed by the red carpets of this world. What shines in his eyes is silent faithfulness, steady dedication, the courage of someone who stands for justice even when no one is watching. Morai didn't need to climb social ladders to become great. He simply stood, and that was enough. And maybe that's the challenge left for us. What are you feeding your soul? The approval of others, the never-ending chase for more, or the peace that only comes when your soul is aligned with God? Because in the end, as the story proves, Haman was forgotten and Morai was exalted. That very night, the king that same night simply couldn't sleep. Nothing unusual had happened. No strange noises, no nightmares, just a quiet restlessness. And what did he do? He asked for the book of the Chronicles of the Kingdom. That dry, bureaucratic reading that on any other day would have just put him to sleep. But not that night, because that night belonged to God. Chapter 6 of the book of Esther is a masterpiece of divine providence. It's as if heaven interrupted the king's sleep just to fulfill a purpose that had been in thee. Didn't sit back with her arms crossed. She threw herself at the king's feet, not with arrogance, but with tears in her eyes and a soul on fire. She pleaded. She begged that the evil decree against her people be undone, that the death sentence written by Hon be revoked. Now, here's the detail that makes it all even more dramatic. Haman had already been hanged, judged, and condemned by the king himself. Justice had been served, but the decree, the order to exterminate the Jews, was still in effect. And not even the king, the most powerful man in the empire, could cancel what had been officially sealed. The tension is real. It's like the shadow of death was still hovering even after the victory. But God in his wisdom opened another path. In response to Esther's cry, the king authorized the creation of a new decree, one that gave the Jews the right to defend themselves, to rise up with courage on the very day they were to be attacked. That new decree turned the tide. It's interesting how God works, isn't it? He could have sent an angel, changed the laws with a snap of his fingers, done everything on his own, but he chose to involve his people in the miracle. He wanted Esther to rise up, Mordecai to speak out, the Jews to take a stand, because God's deliverance almost always comes hand in hand with faith and action. And the result, when that day came, something extraordinary happened. Fear fell upon the enemies. The dread of the Jews spread across all the nations of the empire. People who once mocked or ignored the Jews now respected them, not by force, but because they saw that their God was real, that no one can touch those whom God protects. It's almost ironic, isn't it? Haman's plan meant to destroy ended up revealing the strength and worth of God's people. The hatred he stirred only served to show everyone who was truly on the right side of history. And that still holds true today. When you take a stand in faith, even in the face of sentences that seem irreversible, God writes a new chapter. He does not ignore the cry of the faithful. He transforms death decrees into declarations of victory. And sometimes what the enemy meant as the end, God uses as a beginning. The day all her enemies had come. It was the 13th day of the month of Adar, the very day the enemies of the Jews had planned to wipe God's people from history. But something unexpected happened. The script was flipped upside down. Instead of being destroyed, the Jews prevailed. They defeated those who hated them. In every city, in every province of the vast empire of King Xerxes, Jewish men and women gathered together, united, determined to defend themselves, and fear fell upon their enemies like a heavy shadow. No one had the strength to resist them. And more than that, the officials, the governors, and all those who served the king stood with the Jews. All because of one man, Mordecai. He was no longer just Esther's cousin. Now Mordecai was respected throughout the palace, influential, admired, a name that echoed with authority across the entire kingdom. On that day, the Jews faced their oppressors with courage. In Susa, the capital, 500 enemies were struck down, and the 10 sons of Mon, the one who tried to erase the Jews, fell one by one. Parandata, Dalon, Aspata, Paratha, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridi, and Visata. Yet even with all that victory, they didn't touch the spoils. No looting, no greed, justice. When the king received the report, he looked at Esther and said, "If here in Susa 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman have been killed, imagine what happened in the provinces. Tell me what else you desire, Esther. Your request is my command." Esther, with the same resolve that had guided her until then, replied, "If it pleases the king, let the Jews in Susa have one more day to defend themselves, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be displayed on the gallows for all to see." The king agreed. The next day, the 14th of Adar, 300 more enemies were eliminated in Susa, and again, without taking a single thing. Meanwhile, in the other provinces, the Jews also rose up. On the 13th, they killed 75,000 enemies. But just like in Susa, they took no spoils. It wasn't about wealth, it was about life, freedom, and justice. On the following day, the 14th of Adar, they rested, they feasted, they celebrated their deliverance with joy, banquets, and gratitude. As for the Jews in Susa, who had fought for 2 days, they celebrated on the 15th. That's why, to this day, the Jews who live in rural areas celebrate on the 14th, while those in large cities celebrate on the 15th. It's a holiday marked by joy, the giving of gifts, and care for the poor. Maury recorded everything. He wrote down every detail and sent copies to all the Jews across the empire, even in the most distant corners. He called them all to celebrate the 14th and 15th of Adar every year, so they would never forget that miraculous deliverance. The month that was supposed to be marked by sorrow turned into a time of laughter, celebration, and freedom. What was once mourning became dancing, and the name of that celebration, Purim, in memory of the Pur, the lot that Mon had cast to decide the day of the massacre. Little did he know that while he was rolling the dice, God had already flipped the board. The tradition was established. Generation after generation, the Jews kept Purim with their children, with their grandchildren, with all who came to join the faith of Israel. The memory of that deliverance became an eternal marker. No family was to forget. No city was to remain silent. Purim was meant to be lived, told, and celebrated always. Esther, the courageous queen, didn't stop there. Along with Maury, she sent a second official letter with all the authority of the throne. This letter confirmed Purim as a legitimate sacred celebration, and it was sent to all 127 provinces of Xerxes' empire. She urged the Jews to maintain the fast to remember the tears they had shed and to celebrate from the heart the God who had turned the story upside down. And so, with Esther's signature and Morai's, month of Adar King Xerxes went as far as imposing taxes throughout his entire empire, even in the most distant and forgotten corners. And it wasn't a small thing. If you want to know everything he did, every conquest, every remarkable achievement, and also the brilliant rise of Morai, the one he placed in a position of honor, it's all recorded in the ancient books of the kings of Media and Persia. Now about Maury. Nah, he truly left a legacy. A Jew who, against all odds, became the second most powerful man in the kingdom. Respected, beloved, admired. But what touched people the most wasn't just his position. It was his heart. Morai used his influence not to exalt himself, but to protect his own. He fought for justice, pursued peace, and did everything he could for the good of the Jewish people. He didn't just rise to the top, he brought his people with him. Please subscribe my YouTube channel, African Tales by Selikum. God bless you all.